My name is Myra Finley. I'm 33 years old, and I watched my father freeze mid-applause in front of 300 people. It happened at the Granton Town Hall on a Saturday evening in October. The whole town had come to honor the mystery investor who'd saved our factory, saved 300 jobs, saved the Main Street shops that depend on those paychecks, saved the volunteer fire department that runs on factory family donations. My father stood at the VIP table. His hands came together twice. Then his eyes found the man on stage, and everything stopped. His palms hung in the air like a prayer he couldn't finish. But to understand why that moment broke him, you need to know what he said 6 months earlier, the night he told me my fiancé would never be welcome in his house. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge. This is where families push too far, and the person they underestimated pushes back. If you've ever had someone decide your worth based on a job title, this one's for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Granton, Indiana sits 40 miles south of Indianapolis on a 2-lane state road that smells like diesel in summer and frozen mud in January. 8,000 people, 1 high school, 3 churches, and Finley Manufacturing, the auto parts plant that employs roughly 300 of them. My father, Don Finley, built that factory over 30 years. He started as a floor supervisor, saved every check, bought the plant when old Mr. Kelly retired in '94, and turned it into the largest single employer between Bloomington and Columbus. In Granton, people called him Mr. Finley at the coffee shop, at church, at the gas station. He'd nod back like a man who'd earned the title and intended to keep it. I grew up in the house on Ridgecrest Hill. 3 stories, wrap-around porch, the kind of home that watches over a town. The smell of machine oil from the factory floor was baked into my father's shirts before I learned what perfume was. My mother, Lorraine, chaired every fundraiser the town had. My older sister, Nadia, married a surgeon in Indianapolis and stopped coming home except for holidays. I was the one who stayed. I went to Indiana State, passed the CPA exam at 24, and the same week I signed with Palmer and Gaines, the only accounting firm in Granton. I signed a lease on a 1-bedroom apartment above the hardware store on Elm. My parents couldn't understand it. The house had spare rooms. I had a key. But I'd spent 24 years under a roof where every decision passed through my father first, and I needed to know what my own choices felt like before someone else told me they were wrong. 3 years later, I brought someone home. That's when I learned what my decisions felt like to them. I met Garrett Briggs on a Tuesday in July when the AC unit at Palmer and Gaines died during the worst heat wave Granton had seen in a decade. The office hit 92 degrees by noon. Nancy at the front desk called every HVAC company within 50 miles. Garrett showed up in a white truck with Briggs Climate stenciled on the door, tool belt already buckled, and didn't say a word to anyone until the cold air was blowing again. I came down to sign the invoice. He handed me the clipboard, clean handwriting, itemized parts, labor at a fair rate. I shook his hand to say thank you and caught the smell of compressor oil on his palm. Not grease, not dirt. Something sharper, chemical and warm, the smell of a machine brought back to life. I didn't wash my hand for an hour. We started talking at the diner across the street the following week. Garrett was 33 then, tall, built like someone who carries condensers up stairways for a living. He listened more than he spoke. When he did talk, every sentence landed on something solid. A fact, a number, a plan. No filler. 3 years of dinners, weekend hikes, and quiet evenings on my apartment couch later, he proposed. Not at a restaurant, not on a trip. On my sofa, after fixing the garbage disposal I'd been ignoring for 2 months, with a titanium ring he'd had engraved, built to last. He said he wanted a ring that could survive a job site. I said yes before he finished the sentence. His phone buzzed constantly, 3, sometimes 4 different caller IDs, all with Briggs in the name. I figured he had a lot of clients. I wasn't wrong. I just didn't know the scale yet. I brought Garrett to the house on Ridgecrest Hill on a Sunday in April. Nadia and Stephen had flown in from Indianapolis for the weekend. My mother set the table with the good china. She always did when Stephen visited. I told my father we were coming. He said fine. Garrett drove straight from a service call. He walked in wearing his Briggs Climate polo, navy blue, logo on the chest, name stitched above the pocket. He hadn't had time to change. My father shook his hand at the door with the precision of a man shaking hands with a contractor, not a guest. Lorraine smiled the way she smiles at the UPS driver. Polite, brief, already moving on. Stephen pulled out Garrett's chair, which was decent of him. Nadia sat across the table, tilted her head, and studied Garrett the way she studies a restaurant menu when nothing looks good enough. Dinner started with my father talking about the factory, a new contract with Tri-State Auto Group, expansion plans, equipment upgrades he'd been pricing. He addressed Stephen directly. You know how capital investment works, and Steve, same principle as building a surgical practice. And steered the conversation past Garrett like a highway off-ramp nobody needed. Garrett ate quietly, complimented my mother's pot roast, and didn't fight for airtime. After dessert, Garrett stepped onto the porch to take a call. Nadia leaned across the table. So Garrett, what's the long-term plan? Are you going to keep doing what you're doing? I answered before he could hear. He plans to keep building. Nadia raised an eyebrow. My father pushed back from the table, carried his plate to the sink, and said over his shoulder, He seems fine. But fine isn't a future, Myra. 2 weeks later, I told my parents we were engaged. My father was standing at the kitchen island, reading the Granton Gazette, coffee in his right hand. He set the mug down so hard the handle cracked. You're not serious. I placed the invitation on the counter between us. Ivory cardstock, simple font, Myra Finley and Garrett Briggs, Saturday, 5 o'clock. He fixes air conditioners for God's sake. My father's voice didn't rise. It dropped. The way a man's voice drops when he believes he's stating something so obvious it shouldn't require volume. Do you know what people will say? That Don Finley's daughter married a repairman. I stood on the other side of the island and felt the granite countertop cold under my fingertips. I didn't argue. You can't reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. The engagement is Saturday at 5. The door will be open. He looked at me like I'd handed him a bill he didn't owe. I'm not walking through that door. Then don't. I picked up my purse and left. I didn't look back. Not because I was brave, because I'd already calculated this outcome 3 days earlier, sitting at my kitchen table, running scenarios the way I run audits, probabilities, variables, likely responses. My father didn't Google Garrett, didn't ask a single question about his business, his income, his plans. A man who fixes things for other people, in my father's calculus, was a man who'd never own anything himself. What I knew, what my father had told me in fragments over 30 years of dinner table stories, was that his own father, my grandfather, had been a welder on the Finley manufacturing floor, died of silicosis at 53. Don had clawed his way from the factory floor to the corner office, and in his mind, I was dragging the family back down. My mother called the next morning. Her voice had that careful tone she uses when she's delivering someone else's verdict as her own. Honey, your father is upset. Maybe postpone a few months? Let things cool down. I was at my desk reviewing a small business audit. I didn't close the file. The only thing that needs to cool down is Dad's opinion of my fiancé. Silence. Then, people will talk, honey. I let the sentence sit for a moment. Let them. She didn't come to the engagement. She sent a flower arrangement, white lilies, expensive, tasteful, with a card tucked inside. We love you. We hope you'll reconsider. Not congratulations. Not, we're happy for you. Reconsider, like I'd filed the wrong tax form and still had time to amend. Nadia texted that afternoon. I have a thing in Indy. But honestly, Myra, is that titanium? She followed up an hour later with a bulleted list she called financial questions to ask before committing. She said she and Stephen had gone through them before their wedding and it saved them a lot of surprises. I read every bullet. Net worth, debt-to-income ratio, long-term earning potential, credit score. I thought about Nadia sitting in her 5-bedroom house in Carmel while Stephen worked 70-hour weeks, and I wondered which question on her list covered loneliness. That evening, Stephen called me from his car. He kept his voice low. "For what it's worth, I think Garrett's solid. Don't tell Nadia I said that." I thanked him and hung up. It was the kindest thing anyone in my family had said about Garrett, and it had to be whispered from a parking garage. I set my phone down and started arranging chairs. The engagement party was at Aldo's, the Italian place on 3rd Street with the brick walls and the copper light fixtures. 40 guests, my co-workers from Palmer and Gaines, Jess from the hospital, a few of Garrett's technicians who cleaned up surprisingly well in button-downs, some neighbors, some friends from college who drove in from Bloomington. 2 chairs sat empty in the front row. I'd placed name cards on them. Dawn Finley, Lorraine Finley. I didn't remove them when it became clear no one was coming to fill them. A server asked if she should clear the settings. I told her to leave them. Garrett noticed. He looked at the cards, then at me, and said nothing. He took my hand. His palm still carried traces of compressor oil, scrubbed but not gone, faint like a thumbprint on glass. "Old compressor oil doesn't wash out easy," he said. "Neither do I." My friend Jess gave a toast. She's an ER nurse. No patience for drama, no tolerance for pretense. She held up her glass and said, "Myra doesn't need permission. She never has." The room clapped. I looked at the 2 empty chairs. I looked at Garrett. I looked at the 40 people who had shown up. Not because they owed my father anything, not because they were calculating the social cost, but because they cared about us. I made a note to myself right there, standing in Aldo's with copper light on the brick. Remember this feeling. Not the sadness, the clarity, the understanding that love isn't attendance at someone else's event. It's building your own table and sitting down. 6 weeks later, my father's factory made the front page of the Granton Gazette. Not the business section, the obituary page, the one where dying things go to be counted. The headline read, "Finley Manufacturing loses tri-state auto contract, 300 jobs at risk." I was at my desk when Jess texted me a photo of the paper. Tri-State Auto Group had been my father's anchor client, 40% of the factory's revenue. They'd switched to a supplier in Michigan with newer equipment and lower overhead. My father's CNC machines were 20 years old. His quoting system was a spreadsheet from 2008. The math was ugly, and I did it in my head before I finished my coffee. 300 jobs at an average household income of $40,000 meant $12 million a year disappearing from Granton. The diner would close, the hardware store would shrink, the school would lose tax revenue, one contract loss, and the whole town tilted. I called my father that evening, not to apologize, not to commiserate. I asked a professional question. "Do you need an auditor to look at the books?" He could have said yes. He could have let me help the way I help every small business in this town, with numbers, with clarity, with a plan. Instead, "I don't need your boyfriend's charity, and I don't need my daughter acting like my accountant." Click. I set my phone on the counter and poured a glass of water. I drank it slowly. He didn't need my help. He needed someone's. He just couldn't tell the difference. That night, I opened my laptop and started pulling public filings on Finley Manufacturing, tax liens, equipment depreciation schedules, county property records, the SBA loan my father had taken out in 2019. I organized them into a memo template I use for acquisition candidates, not for my father, for someone who would actually read it. I sat at my kitchen table with financial statements spread out. My father's factory on one side, my fiancé's holding company on the other, and I realized I was the only person in Granton who could see both pictures at once. If you've ever been the person nobody listens to until they needed you, hit subscribe. This story's just getting started. The memo took me 3 nights. I pulled everything available in public records, Finley Manufacturing's fixed assets, 4 CNC milling machines, 2 stamping presses, a powder coating line installed in 2006. Customer list minus Tri-State still showed 60% of revenue intact, spread across regional auto shops and aftermarket distributors. The workforce averaged 12 years of tenure. These weren't entry-level assemblers. They were skilled machinists, welders, quality inspectors. That kind of institutional knowledge doesn't rebuild. The numbers told a specific story. The factory wasn't dead. It was starved. It needed capital for equipment modernization, 1/4 of cash buffer to stabilize payroll, and a management partner who understood industrial operations. A textbook turnaround candidate. I knew Garrett had been exploring expansion. Briggs Climate Holdings already serviced industrial HVAC systems for 3 manufacturing plants in southern Indiana. A factory acquisition would give him a vertical, install and maintain climate systems in his own facility, plus a diversified revenue stream outside residential HVAC. The synergy was real, not theoretical. I formatted the memo: clean, clinical, no emotion. Executive summary, financial overview, risk assessment, upside projections. At the bottom I wrote, "I think this is worth a look. The numbers are here." I emailed it to Garrett from my work address. He read it that evening on the couch next to me, scrolling on his phone while I pretended to watch a cooking show. After 10 minutes, he set the phone down. "I've been watching this one for 6 months." I turned. 6 months? Since the Tri-State rumors started. I had Ruth pull the county filings last spring. The memo I'd spent 3 nights building was the last piece he needed, not the first. I wasn't opening a door for Garrett. I was confirming the door was worth walking through. The following week, Garrett invited me to see the Briggs Climate Holdings office, not in Granton, in Shelburne, 20 minutes north, second floor of a limestone building above a dentist's office. I'd done Garrett's books for 2 years. I knew the numbers, but I'd never stood in the room where the numbers became real. 4 desks, a whiteboard spanning the back wall, a map of Indiana and Ohio with 14 colored pins, each one a company Garrett owned. Ruth Whelan, his CFO, sat at the corner desk. She was 54, former SBA loan officer at Granton Savings, and she'd quit the bank to join Garrett 8 years ago when most people in town still thought he was a one-truck operation. Ruth shook my hand and pointed at the map. He bought the first company at 26 with an SBA loan and a Chevy Silverado. 14 acquisitions since. We cleared $18 million in consolidated revenue last year. He still answers emergency calls on Sundays. I watched Garrett across the room, talking to his operations manager about a parts order. Same polo, same work boots, same man who'd shown up to my parents' dinner table and been dismissed in under 90 minutes. "Your fiancé could buy a Porsche," Ruth said. "He drives the company truck because he says the guys respect a boss who shows up dirty." I already knew all of this. I'd reconciled the accounts. But hearing Ruth say it, a woman who'd staked her career on Garrett before anyone else believed, reframed something. The world outside this room had no idea. My parents had no idea. They'd built an entire verdict on a polo shirt and the smell of compressor oil, and they hadn't spent 14 minutes investigating what that polo shirt represented. My mother called the next week and suggested lunch. I agreed because I still loved her, and loving someone doesn't require approving of everything they've done. We met at the cafe on Maple, neutral ground, public enough that voices stayed low. She ordered her usual herbal tea and placed her hands flat on the table like a negotiator. "Myra, I want to understand. What is it about him?" I wrapped both hands around my coffee. "He works harder than anyone I know. He built something from nothing." She tilted her head the way she does when she's about to repackage my father's opinion as maternal concern. "He fixes things, Myra, that's all. That's what he does." I set my cup down. "He builds, Mom. There's a difference. You'd see it if you looked." She shifted tactics. "Your father is going through a terrible time with the factory. This isn't the moment to what? Exist? Plan my own life?" She flinched. Not from the words, but from the tone. Level. Measured. The voice I use when presenting audit findings to a client who doesn't want to hear them. I stood, put a $10 bill on the table, and picked up my jacket. "When you're ready to meet the man I'm marrying, not the version you invented, you know where I live." I walked out. Through the glass, I saw my mother sit motionless for a long moment, staring at the empty chair across from her. Something crossed her face. Not anger. Something older. Recognition. I'd seen a photograph of my mother at 25, walking out of her own parents' house after they told her Don Finley wasn't good enough. She'd fought that battle and won. She just forgot which side she was supposed to be on. 2 weeks later, the Granton Economic Development Board received an anonymous letter of intent. The factory was bleeding. Production dropped to 55% capacity. My father cut overtime, froze hiring, and started covering payroll gaps with personal savings. A fact I knew because the county filings showed a personal guarantee lien filed against the Ridgecrest Hill house. 300 families watched the parking lot thin out every week. Jess told me the ER was seeing it already. Stress migraines, chest pain that turns out to be anxiety. A machinist's wife came in last Tuesday convinced she was having a heart attack. It was a panic attack. She's 31. Granton doesn't have a backup plan. There's no second factory. No tech campus moving in. If Finley Manufacturing closes, the town doesn't downsize. It disappears. My father went to 3 banks in 2 weeks. First National in Columbus, Heartland in Bloomington, a regional office of Chase in Indianapolis. All 3 reviewed his balance sheet, looked at the equipment age, and passed. Collateral too old. Revenue too concentrated. Risk too high. He came home from the 3rd meeting and sat in his home office until midnight. I know because Lorraine told Jess, and Jess told me. I felt the over-responsibility rise in my chest, the familiar urge to fix, to intervene, to put a spreadsheet in front of the problem and force it into columns. But I remembered his voice on the phone. I don't need my daughter acting like my accountant. So I didn't call. I updated Garrett instead. The timeline is accelerating. If someone's going to move, it needs to be soon. Garrett's reply came 20 minutes later. Due diligence is almost done. I hired Kelsey Grant's firm out of Terre Haute for the audit. No conflict with Palmer and Gaines. Clean. Professional. The way he does everything. The Gazette ran the story on a Wednesday. Anonymous buyer submits letter of intent to acquire Finley Manufacturing. Deal could save 300 jobs. By Thursday morning, the cafe on Maple had turned into a speculation engine. I sat in my usual booth and listened. I heard it's a private equity group from Chicago. My cousin works at the county clerk's office. She says the filing came from an LLC in Indiana. Somebody told me it was Ford looking for a satellite plant. I drank my coffee and said nothing. The town was building a mythology around a man they'd never met, and every theory landed somewhere impressive. Wall Street, Detroit, Silicon Valley. Nobody guessed Shelburne. Nobody guessed 14 HVAC companies and a Chevy Silverado. My father called me that evening. First time since the engagement blow-up. And even now, the call wasn't about Garrett or an apology. His voice was careful, measured, the tone of a man holding a rope he's afraid to pull. This buyer, it might be real. Someone's actually looking at the plant. I waited. You're an accountant. If someone sends me a term sheet, can you read it for me? There it was. Not an olive branch. A transaction. He needed my expertise the way he'd need a plumber. Specific, functional, temporary. Every instinct I had as his daughter wanted to say yes. To be useful. To be the one he finally turned to. But I was already on the other side of this deal. I'd written the acquisition memo. I'd helped Garrett's team evaluate the target. A CPA who advises both sides of a transaction isn't helpful. She's a liability. I can't take this engagement, Dad. I have a prior professional relationship that creates a conflict of interest. What conflict? One I'm not at liberty to disclose, but Tom Hadley at Palmer & Gaines has 30 years of M&A advisory experience. He'll give you a stronger review than I would. The silence stretched for 6 seconds. Fine. He hung up. I poured another cup of coffee and thought about term sheets, and about how the one heading toward my father's desk had my fiancé's initials buried 3 layers deep in the LLC structure, and about how declining was the hardest professional decision I'd made in 9 years of practice. Tom Hadley called me the following Friday. Professional courtesy between colleagues at the same firm, he wanted local market context before finishing his review of the term sheet. I gave him what I could without crossing any lines. Granton's employment base, the factory's role in the regional economy, the downstream businesses that depended on those paychecks, standard background that any CPA in town could provide, nothing privileged, nothing from the deal itself. After we hung up, I sat at my desk and thought about the acquiring entity listed on that document. BCH Acquisitions, LLC. I knew the letters. BCH Briggs, Climate Holdings. My father didn't. Tom wouldn't either. Garrett's attorney had registered the LLC in Delaware specifically for this transaction, with no publicly searchable link to the parent company. Standard asset protection, standard privacy. 3 days later, Tom sent Don his assessment. The acquisition price of $4.2 million reflected fair market value of fixed assets, plus a goodwill premium for the workforce. Full retention of all 300 employees for 24 months. A $1.8 million equipment modernization fund, a 12-month paid consultancy for Don to assist with the transition. Tom recommended proceeding to due diligence. I learned all of this secondhand, through Garrett, through his attorney, through the fact that Don's lawyer called to schedule the next round of meetings. The deal was moving. I sat at my kitchen table and thought about calling Don right then. Dad, the buyer is Garrett, the man you called a repairman, the man whose ring you mocked. He's about to save your factory and every job in this town. I ran the scenario forward. Don would reject the deal. Not because the terms were bad, because his ego couldn't survive owing his livelihood to the man he'd exiled. 300 families would pay the price for one man's pride. I closed the scenario. I closed my laptop. The deal was bigger than my family, and keeping silent was the most responsible thing I could do. That weekend, I moved the last of my things into Garrett's house, a 1-story ranch on Sycamore Lane, 3 bedrooms, a workshop out back, a lawn that needed mowing, the kind of house that costs what it's worth and nothing more. While unpacking a box of books in the spare bedroom, I pulled open the bottom drawer of Garrett's old desk, the one he'd had since his first apartment. Inside, a manila folder, soft at the edges, held together by a rubber band that crumbled when I touched it. I opened it. On top was a business card, printed at a FedEx on West Washington Street 14 years ago. I could tell because